Tonight's speaker, Bill Taubman, is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst University. His book, Khrushchev, The Man in His Era, won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. His biography, Gorbachev, His Life and Times, was the finalist for the 2018 National Book Critics Circle. He has also authored Stalin's American Policy, from Entente to Détente to Cold War. And Bill tells me he's working on a book on Robert McNamara, which I'm looking forward to, this very, very interesting character in American history. But in any case, Bill spoke here before on Khrushchev, and we're so glad that tonight he's going to come back and talk about both Khrushchev and Gorbachev. So please join me in welcoming, for the second time, Bill Taubman.
Thank you very much. I have a microphone on my lapel, so I don't think I'm yoked to this one. We'll soon see, however. My pleasure to be back here again. That, of course, is Mikhail Gorbachev up there, and I have a PowerPoint presentation which is about him, because that book came out 2 years ago, and I've been giving talks in various places around the country, and I haven't yet included Khrushchev in the PowerPoint presentation. So if there are any Khrushchev fans here who feel offended that he isn't getting equal time with Gorbachev, that's the explanation. I wanted to start with a quote from a British historian of the 19th century named Thomas Carlyle, who once said the following: "History is but the biography of great men." Wrong. There are women, right? History is about men and women. But history is also more than the biography of particular men and women. It's the product of social forces, economic conditions, international developments, ideas and institutions. But there are some political leaders who are decisive in history, political leaders who make a huge difference, political leaders who shape their countries and the world. And two of those people, I believe, are Khrushchev and Gorbachev. Just think about it. Khrushchev denounced Stalin in 1956 in a famous secret speech, which was really the very beginning of a long process which ended in the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years later. Khrushchev was also the man who sent missiles to Cuba. Some of you with gray hair will remember that, as I do, which was probably the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. And Gorbachev helped destroy Soviet totalitarianism when he was in power from 85 to 91. And more than anyone else, even Ronald Reagan, and I'll talk about Gorbachev and Reagan, Gorbachev was the man who ended the Cold War. So if I'm right, then we have two of these very, very powerful historical figures. Let me say a word about two things that equip them or that qualify them to be put in that category. One is the power that they had. They had the power as leaders of, in Khrushchev's case, a still totalitarian country. In Gorbachev's case, well, it was beginning to fall apart, but maybe we should call it a quasi-totalitarian country. They were not constrained, as democratic leaders are in democracies, by things such as the rule of law, free press, interest groups, constitutional norms. So they had the power, if they chose to use it, to change their countries and the world. And the second thing that's of interest about them, this is a little bit more arguable, but I think they were both unique. Unique in the sense that no one else in their position would have done what they did. They did what no one else would have done in their position. Now, if they had done what others in their position would have done, we could say, well, they all shared some of the same values that were extant in their societies, and hence they all might have done something similar. Or we might say that they were responding to the dictates of the situation they faced, which would have led not just them, but others to do what they did. But in this case, I think that is not true about either of them. Let's take Khrushchev for a minute and that secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin. There was nobody else in the Soviet leadership who would have given that speech, with one exception. You may remember the name Lavrenti Beria. He was the secret police chief. He had blood up to his neck. And he wanted to become Stalin's successor. And one of the ways he was making his case was to seem to be more human than he actually was. And I think he was cynical enough to have given an attack on Stalin, as Khrushchev did, in order to make himself look acceptable. But he wasn't around anymore in 1956 because Khrushchev had led a conspiracy to arrest him and liquidate him in 1953. Or take the Cuban missiles, the missiles sent to Cuba. I've studied that enough to know, I've interviewed people who were involved in that decision, and I could argue at greater length, but I won't, that Khrushchev was the only one who would have done that. The others who knew about it as it was being planned would have told him not to, except they were afraid of him. The only person who told him that it was the wrong thing to do was his foreign policy assistant, Troyanovsky, who told him, but it was too late. Khrushchev was already embarked on it. And one reason that they didn't tell him that they thought it was a screwy idea was that he didn't ask them for their opinion. And they knew enough not to offer their opinion if it wasn't requested. So I think Khrushchev was unique in both those instances. And Gorbachev was unique in the sense that he attempted to fully or almost fully democratize Russia or the Soviet Union, a country which had never known democracy in its history. The Politburo, of which he was the leader, consisted of about 12 to 15 people, but by the end of his time in power, only 3 of them supported what he was doing. This again argues that he was unique. Only 3 of them supported him, but they were only in a position to support him because he had either put them there or kept them there. In other words, they were not independent figures in their own right. He was the man who insisted on trying to transform the Soviet Union. I have one other quote about his uniqueness. This is from a wonderful Russian historian, now dead, I'm afraid, but who wrote of Gorbachev. He said, Gorbachev was the only politician in Russian history who, having full power in his hands, voluntarily opted to limit it and even risk losing it in the name of principled moral values. Now that's quite a claim, because now it goes beyond any Soviet leader and now saying he was unique in Russian history, or at least among Russian leaders. Now, the interesting further point, before I delve in more detail into both Khrushchev and Gorbachev, is that if somebody changes the world and is unique in doing what he or she does, this drives us back to consider their character, their personality, to explain what they did, because others wouldn't have done it. And if they did it, it must be something about them that prompts them to do it, something about the way that they think, or the way that their mind works, or the way that their psyche functions. And so it drives us back, to put it differently, to biography, to try to figure out who they were, how they became that way, and why they did what they did. And of course, my 2 books are biographies of Khrushchev and Gorbachev. And so I'm going to focus on biography in the case of both of them to explain those unique things that only they did that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And to organize this talk, I want to pose 4 big questions and try to answer them about both Khrushchev and Gorbachev. The first has to do with how they became the leaders that they were. How did Khrushchev become Khrushchev? How did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? The second question is, how did the regime decide to make them its leaders? Khrushchev, who was going to try to reform that regime, and Gorbachev, who was going to transform it or attempt to transform it. The third question is, why did Khrushchev and Gorbachev embark, Khrushchev on reform, Gorbachev on transformation, and why did they fail? And the last question has to do with their role in foreign policy. What explains the fact that under Khrushchev, the Cold War rose to what we might call its peak? The Berlin crisis of 1958 to 62, the Cuban crisis of 1962. And what explains the fact that, as I said at the start, that Gorbachev, even more than anyone else, even more than Ronald Reagan, was the man who ended the Cold War? So those are the big 4 questions I have in mind. And to answer them fully, one would have to talk about more than the biographies of Khrushchev and Gorbachev, because they didn't act in a vacuum. But I'm going to argue that key elements of their character, of their personality, help to explain what they did, how they succeeded, and why in other ways they failed. Okay, so back to the first question. How did they become the leaders that they were? And here, again, one could go on, but I'm going to focus on their parents and on their education to try to explain how they became who they were. Khrushchev was born in 1894. He was in a poor peasant family. And I'm going to oversimplify here and play a bit of the psychologist in talking about his parents. But the thing I would say about his mother was she was a very strong woman who idolized her son. And his father was a kind of ne'er-do-well man for whom his mother didn't have a great deal of respect. And as I looked at his childhood and the man he became, it seemed to me that one might say that Khrushchev's ambition and aspiration to become a big shot had a lot to do with the way in which his mother encouraged him to think that that's exactly what he was destined to become, and probably had something to do with his wanting to avoid the fate of his father, at least as his mother understood his father. As to his education, this is quite remarkable. Khrushchev had a total of 2 years, maybe 3, of formal education in an elementary school. That's it. Later on in life, he took adult education programs, but he was so busy being a kind of politician in those schools that he paid very little attention to his education. I managed, believe it or not, to track down one of his teachers, who'd been his teacher in the 1920s. She was living in a rest home outside of Moscow, and that's precisely what she said. A very smart man, but no interest in his studies because he was always in the hall talking about politics. So he has minimal education and even less culture. A famous Soviet sculptor, a liberal who emigrated to Queens, but before he did design the monument at Khrushchev's grave, and who met him before, said that Khrushchev was the most uncultured man he'd ever met. And there are some examples in the book which I could quote to you, but I don't happen to have here, which illustrate just how crude and rude and uncultured he could be. Now, the result of this was that, A, he wasn't really prepared to govern a vast transcontinental empire, which is what the Soviet Union was. And psychologically, when he made mistakes in governing that vast transcontinental empire, which he was bound to do because he wasn't prepared really to do it, this, I think, seemed to confirm to him that he wasn't educated enough. He was very sensitive about that. And one of the things I discovered in reading about him was that he tended to lash out to try to save situations which he had caused himself by his mistakes, which actually led to further problems for him. Gorbachev. Gorbachev was born in 1931, which means that he grew up in terrible times. Famine took two of his aunts and uncles. Both of his grandfathers were arrested and sent into the Gulag, although they somehow managed to get out after a while. Famine struck his village again in 1944 and 1946. And then late Stalinism was a miasma of fear for many people in the Soviet Union. And yet, this man, growing up in these terrible times, emerges as remarkably optimistic, confident, full of self-esteem, and trusting in other people. And that's a kind of miracle, because one of the things people learned under Stalin was how not to trust others, because they might inform on you. And if they informed on you to the secret police, that might be the end for you, because you'd be arrested and taken away in the middle of the night. Now, these qualities, optimistic, confident, trusting, loom very large later in his career, because he's optimistic enough to think that he can transform, can democratize a country that's never known democracy. He thinks he can do it, and he trusts the people to govern themselves. Now, the question then becomes, what explains these qualities of character? How does he become a man like this? And here again, and here I do have a bit to show you, if I can make this work right. He had a grandfather. There he is with his grandfather and his grandmother, and there's Gorbachev as a little boy. And from everything I've read about him and talked to him, my wife and I should say, interviewed him 8 times over the years 2007 to 2016. And apparently this grandfather was a quite wonderful man who loved him and supported him and made him feel wonderful and valued. And here's a picture of Gorbachev's father, who was also, by all accounts, a quite wonderful man. I think you can see it in his eyes, but maybe I'm reading that into his eyes. But he, again, as a peasant patriarch, he could have dominated his son. He didn't. He encouraged him. And he, together at one point, when Gorbachev was in high school, they competed in a competition to bring in the harvest, operating a huge combine and competing with other teams. And they won. They set records, whereupon the state offered his father the highest medal or honor it could award any of its citizens, the Order of Lenin. And his father said, "I'd like to share it with my son." And they said, "He's too young." So they gave Gorbachev instead something called the Order of the Red Labor Banner, which was the second highest award they could offer. And that, again, is a sign of how his father treated him. I should talk more about his mother. There she is with Gorbachev as a boy. And there she is with Gorbachev as a young man and his younger brother. She was actually very harsh. And in one of the most stunning moments in our interviews with Gorbachev was when he suddenly said in our first interview, he said, when I was 12, my mother picked up her belt to whip me again. I was surprised he was telling us this in the first place. It didn't seem like the kind of thing you'd want to talk about to a stranger. And he said, I then grabbed her arm and I pulled it down and I said, never again. And then he described it to us. He said, And then she wept. And I might have had the guts to ask, well, why was she weeping? But before I did, he said, she was weeping because I was the last thing she could control, and now she could no longer control me. Well, this story, you might say, changes the picture of a boy growing up in such a supported family. But on the other hand, she kept him alive during the war when his father was away at the front for 4 years and almost was killed herself in the process. What about Gorbachev's education? He was a star student in high school and a leading political figure in the Young Communist League. He dared to talk back to his teachers, which is almost unheard of at that time in Soviet schools. And we know the story of his girlfriend, which whom I'll show you a picture of. He was a young thespian, an actor in a drama group. So there he is in the middle, and the girl in the white dress is his girlfriend. And she tells a fascinating story about how once upon a time she was supposed to be editing the school newspaper, which was a wall newspaper because they didn't have paper to print on. And Gorbachev came into the building where she was doing this and discovered she'd made a mistake. And he bawled her out. And then he took her into the editorial board meeting and bawled her out again. And then when they left the building later that afternoon, he asked her out. And she said to him, "How can you do this? First you bawl me out, humiliate me, and then you ask me out." And according to her, his reply was, "My dear, these are two different realms." Now this is arrogance. This isn't just confidence and optimism, but this is a sign of a guy who, is on top of the world and willing to tell about it and show it to other people. He goes on to the university. Compare that to Khrushchev, who finishes 2 years of elementary school. He goes on to the best university in the country, Moscow State University. And again, he is a kind of star, a star student, a leading political figure, very smart circle of friends who later go on to interesting careers in the Soviet Union. And he meets two people at the university who are crucial to his life. One of them is his wife, the woman he marries, Raisa. We'll see another picture of her later, who was a year younger than he, but a year ahead of him at the university, and who in the beginning was a kind of mentor to him because she was more sophisticated and more experienced than he was. The other person he meets who becomes his best friend is a Czech exchange student named Zdeněk Mlynář. And the interesting thing about this guy is that in 1968, Mlynář is Alexander Dubček's right-hand man in carrying out the Prague Spring, that is, trying to transform and democratize Czechoslovakia. Now, in the early 50s, when Gorbachev and Mlynář are best friends at Moscow University, Mlynář is presumably not yet what he's going to become, but we have stories about them, which I include in the book, which show that they are both already liberating themselves from indoctrination and propaganda. And one of the stories is they go together to see a Soviet, believe it or not, it sounds like an oxymoron, a Stalinist musical comedy, a film. There were a lot of these, and they were actually pretty good films. I've seen some of them. And this one takes place in the countryside, where the happy peasants are bringing in the harvest, which they do, singing as they work. And then the milkmaids descend on the store to buy fabrics for their clothes and a piano for their collective farm. And as they're watching this film, Gorbachev whispers to Mlynář, "It isn't true, none of it. They wouldn't work at all if they weren't forced to, and there's nothing to buy in the stores." So you can see Gorbachev, as he's getting educated, is beginning to be a doubter, if not a dissident. Okay, why does the regime make them its leaders? Let's take Khrushchev first again. Khrushchev was ill-educated, but he was smart and shrewd and very hard-working. He climbed the ladder of the Communist Party in Ukraine, where he was growing up. He was not Ukrainian, but Russian. I emphasize this today since there's so much discussion in the paper of Ukraine and Russia. And in 1929, he moves to Moscow to take an adult education course. And here, something lucky happens. It turns out that one of his fellow students at the Moscow Academy, where he's studying, is Stalin's wife. And they become friends. And Stalin notices him. And Stalin likes him. And Stalin promotes him so that by 1935, Khrushchev is the party boss of Moscow. And by 1938, he's the party boss of Ukraine. And as we know, by 1955, after Stalin's death, or 54, depends how you want to count it, he's the party boss of the Soviet Union itself. Now, what is his secret? How does he get promoted in this way? Well, it has something to do with his being seemingly loyal and hardworking and smart and shrewd. But here again, I want to emphasize something about his character. He was underestimated by Stalin and by his rivals, that is, Khrushchev's rivals, to succeed Stalin. They all thought of him as ill-educated and something of a joke. He was a kind of jester in Stalin's court. How do I know this? Well, I've read what some of them said about him, and I've seen a wonderful piece of newsreel footage in which Stalin and the other leaders, you probably, if you're old enough, remember these scenes. They're standing on the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square as the people are marching by on Revolution Day or May Day. And so Stalin is sort of looking like this, and up comes Khrushchev with a big smile on his face, and sort of comes up and leans over and is obviously telling a joke to Stalin and waiting for the reaction, which never comes. But nonetheless, this picture for me sort of symbolized the role that Khrushchev played, the way he presented himself. He played the fool, in a way, in Stalin's court. Now, I might even go on to say, I do say in the book, that he played the fool so well because, in part, as a result of his lack of education and culture, he was a fool. That is, he's going to make foolish mistakes later on, especially after he becomes Soviet leader. Okay, Gorbachev. Gorbachev climbs the party ladder in a city in southern Russia called Stavropol, where my wife and I visited 2 weeks one time, 3 weeks another time. We talked to people who had worked with him and who didn't like him, 12 or 13 of them. And we learned the following, that Gorbachev appeared to be what the Soviets used to call the perfect image of the new Soviet man. The new Soviet man was what they claimed to have been creating among their people. That is, people who were smart, educated, honest, idealistic. Some of them were, but an awful lot of them weren't. At any rate, Gorbachev appeared to be this way. In all of our interviews in Stavropol, when we asked people, what was your first impression of Gorbachev? The answer almost always was the Russian word erudированный, which means erudite. That is, a university man from Moscow coming back to his home area to work. And the other thing they all talked about was how well he treated his wife. Now, I won't go into this in length, but I visited the Soviet Union or Russia up to 25 times in my career. I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot of bureaucrats mistreating women. I don't mean intimately, that wasn't open to me, but I remember one time when on a Khrushchev research visit, I went with Khrushchev's son and daughter-in-law to a city where Khrushchev had been climbing the ladder. We were hosted by party bureaucrats. They took us to breakfast in the hotel cafeteria, and at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, they were downing vodka and chasing the waitresses around the cafeteria. Into the kitchen, you could hear squeals and stuff. It was just terrible. But Gorbachev wasn't like that. He was a good man, or seemed to be, and that attracted the attention and admiration of people like Yuri Andropov and other Soviet leaders who vacationed in the northern Caucasus, which was Gorbachev's bailiwick, and he was their host. So it was Andropov who promoted him and then brought him to Moscow in 1978, where for 7 years he prepared, as it turned out, to become the Soviet leader in 1985. Why the Soviet leader? Because most of the other contenders were old, very old and feeble. He was the youngest, he was the most energetic, he seemed to be the best educated, and they chose him, hoping that he would carry out minimal reforms, but of course he didn't. He carried out maximal reforms. Okay, next question. Why did Khrushchev try to reform the Soviet Union and Gorbachev to transform it? Well, in Khrushchev's case, you have to begin with the fact that he had blood, as he himself said in retirement, "I have blood up to my elbows." He had signed off on death lists that sent many people to death, including some of his own collaborators and friends. But compared to others of Stalin's henchmen, when they became kind of machines and lost their humanity, he retained his. And he was even in some part of his self a decent man. I discovered in retrospect that he hadn't drunk when he was a young man, he hadn't smoked, and he hadn't womanized either. Later on, Stalin forced him to drink, as he did all of his associates, to try to loosen their tongues so that if they had anything hostile or threatening in mind toward him, they would blurt it out and he could do away with them. At any rate, Khrushchev developed a kind of anger at what Stalin had done and also what Stalin had made him do. How do I know this? Well, I interviewed a woman who described a scene in 1940, 16 years before Stalin gives his secret speech, Khrushchev gives his secret speech denouncing Stalin. And this woman described how Khrushchev had visited her father, who'd been a childhood friend of hers. And Khrushchev sort of magnanimously invites her father to join the party and come to Kiev, where he's now the Ukrainian party boss, and he'll push him forward in his career. And this guy says, "I'm not joining that party, not after what they've done, not after they've killed." And then he mentions 4 or 5 people, 2 of whom were friends of Khrushchev, who were liquidated by Stalin. And at this point, according to this daughter, she said there was nobody else in the room except the 3 of them, she, Khrushchev, and her father. Khrushchev says something like, "Don't blame me for that. I didn't want it to be done, and I'll never forgive him for it, and someday I'll settle with that," and he uses the word, forgive me, "that prick, Stalin." Now, if he really said this was a hell of a dangerous thing to say in 1940, even if there were no police in the room. And if you think it was not said, or he didn't mean it, well, he must have meant it if he said it. He wouldn't have said it otherwise. That 56 speech shows that this is the way he felt when he denounced Stalin. Okay, now why did they fail? Why did Khrushchev get ousted in 1964? Why was Gorbachev in effect ousted in 1991? Neither of them having succeeded in accomplishing the reforms that Khrushchev wanted to carry out, and in Gorbachev's, the democratic transformation of Russia. Well, in Khrushchev's case, he was resisted by the hardliners in the Communist Party, by the Stalinists who remained in the Soviet leadership. When he gave that secret speech, what it resulted in was revolution in Hungary and a near revolution in Poland, and his enemies in the leadership threw that in his face. And he made plenty of mistakes at home, Khrushchev did, planting corn in places where it wouldn't grow, embarking on the cultural thaw, which many of his colleagues thought went much too far. And in foreign policy, he sought, I try to show this in the book, to ease tensions with the West. Instead, he produced or helped to produce the Berlin crisis of '58 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So what I'm saying, in effect, is that his own character played a role in his failure, in addition to the resistance he encountered in society. What about Gorbachev? Why does he embark on democratization? Well, it has something to do with the doubts that have been developing in his mind all through his life. He comes into power wanting to carry out, if in the beginning, minor changes that will make the system work better. But when they are resisted, he decides that the Communist Party is thwarting him and preventing the reforms from working. And he decides to deal the party a mortal blow, to carry out the first free elections, or almost free elections, in the Soviet Union in 1989, and to create a genuine parliament, not a rubber stamp one, which the Soviet Union had boasted. Now, why does he do this? It's partly a matter of conviction. These are the ideas that he's developed, but it's also a matter of his character. Go back to that optimism, that confidence, that trust in other people. That, you have to understand that to understand why he could embark on this seemingly impossible task and why he could trust the Soviet people to make it work. Now, this optimism and confidence also played a role in the way he coped with the resistance he encountered. He was worried that he, like Khrushchev, would be ousted for trying to change the system. But as he put it later, he viewed his hardline opponents as what he called them rabid dogs who could be controlled if they were kept on a tight leash. To use Machiavelli's term, he kept his friends close, but his enemies closer, trying to control them by sort of wrapping them in an alliance. The trouble with this was that they eventually tried to oust him in the August 1991 coup, and furthermore, his embrace of them, which he thought would control them, convinced the radical Democrats like Yeltsin and others, not that Yeltsin was a Democrat really, but he became the leader of the Democrats, convinced them that Gorbachev was in the pocket of the hardliners. So in the end, Gorbachev was left alone in the middle with the radical Democrats on one side and the hardliners on the other. What about Yeltsin? Again, Gorbachev's confidence and optimism and trust. He thought that Yeltsin was a loose cannon who would never really amount to anything. But Yeltsin defeated him. I see that we're still looking at Gorbachev in high school. When I give talks and my wife is in the audience, I usually see her going. So let me finish, and then I'll quickly take you through the rest of the pictures that I happen to have here, because I'm now up to the last question. How to explain the fact that Khrushchev led the Cold War to its peak and that Gorbachev, in effect, ended it? Well, I think Khrushchev functioned according to the following. This sounds like a Russian proverb. I don't know whether it actually is. But in effect, his motto was, when dealing with the West, be my friend or I'll break your neck. That's what he did. He set out to ease tensions with the West, but when John Foster Dulles wouldn't play ball, as Khrushchev wanted to, when Eisenhower held back in the 1950s, Khrushchev decided to force the issue by issuing the Berlin Ultimatum in November 1958, and then not getting what he wanted and renewing that ultimatum with Kennedy at Vienna in June 1961. Khrushchev then decided to put the missiles in Cuba, partly as to prepare for a showdown with Kennedy over Berlin. That wasn't the only reason he put missiles in Cuba. He was also trying to equalize the imbalance in nuclear strength. The United States had more intercontinental rockets. The Soviets had fewer, so they put missiles in Cuba trying to even the balance. So there he had calculations that led him to do that. But again, personality enters into it. Because I discovered, and I talk about this at the beginning of the Khrushchev book, that in 1961, when Kennedy was preparing for the Vienna summit, he commissioned the CIA to do a study of Khrushchev's personality. And they did. They didn't publish it. They still haven't published it. They don't like to reveal that sort of thing, how they come by their views of foreign leaders. But one psychiatrist of many whom they gathered was daring enough to write about it. And he said they had discovered or come to the conclusion that Khrushchev was hypomanic. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding is it's a version of bipolar disorder with the emphasis on mania rather than depression. So I looked that up in the diagnostic manual, and sure enough, it talks about among the characteristics of hypermanic people are things like great schemes, racing thought, lack of cognitive coherence. And in a sense, that's what was going on in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev came up with this idea, which was really a crackpot idea, of hiding missiles on freighters and sending the freighters 10,000 miles across the ocean to Cuba and unloading them and then trucking them through the jungles, all on the assumption that this wouldn't be discovered, including by American U-2 flights over Cuba. The miracle is it almost wasn't discovered, but in the end it was. And so what I'm saying is that I think some of Khrushchev's hyperactivity had to do with this hypomania. One more sort of characterological explanation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that I know that by 1962, Khrushchev's domestic programs weren't working that well. And he was under increasing criticism, very quiet to be sure, from his colleagues. And I saw the Cuban Missile adventure as a way to sort of solve all of his problems with one fell swoop. The Cuban Cure-All is the title of the chapter. That is, if he could get away with this, get the missiles in there, get Kennedy to concede, emerge triumphant, suddenly he would look better at home as well as in the world. Now, Gorbachev, what leads him to be able to work with Ronald Reagan as the almost perfect partner in ending the Cold War, which is itself a miracle after all. Think, Reagan is the arch-conservative American president. Gorbachev is the communist leader of the Soviet Union. What explains the fact that over 3 years they could have 4 summits, Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, 5, Moscow, New York, all between 85 and 88, and in effect end the Cold War. That required not just Reagan, of course, but George H.W. Bush. But Reagan and Gorbachev is the real puzzle. Well, I concluded it was partly because they shared a dream that very few of their own associates shared, namely of abolishing nuclear weapons. This turns out to have been Reagan's dream, and it was also Gorbachev's. And it helps to explain why they could work together. But when I read the transcripts, which are available, of the summit conferences, and especially the first one in Geneva in 1985, every word of what Reagan says to Gorbachev and Gorbachev says to Reagan, I didn't see that kind of coming together. They're rather stilted, they're strained, they're tense. So what is bringing them together besides that nuclear dream, which isn't yet, neither one can see happening? Well, it turns out that their personalities are similar. And here I will indulge myself by reading a little bit from the Gorbachev book. Reagan had a chief of staff, you may remember him, named Donald Regan. And Regan, in his memoir, says, Gorbachev and Reagan looked, quote, like a couple of fellows who had run into each other at the club and discovered that they had a lot in common. Reagan said to Gorbachev that they had both come from similar beginnings. Both began life in small farming communities, yet here they were, says Reagan to Gorbachev, with the fate of the world in their hands, so to speak. And then I add my own comparisons. They both had happy childhoods and harsh times. Both preferred to reminisce about only one of their parents, Gorbachev about his father, Reagan about his mother because his father was an alcoholic. Each was an optimist who believed, as Reagan's biographer put it, that, quote, success was there for the finding and that it would surely come his way. A whole series of parallels. They were different people, of course, different political views in many ways, but some of these basic characteristics were similar. And then there's this is the last thing I'll quote. This is from a book by Francis Fitzgerald about Reagan. And it describes Reagan's marriage to Nancy Reagan in words that apply perfectly to Gorbachev's marriage to Raisa. You can substitute Gorbachev for Reagan and it works. So that's what I'm going to read. Nancy devoted herself to her husband, as Raisa did. I'm adding that. And the marriage became an extremely happy one, as the Gorbachevs did. Temperamentally, the two were as different as people could be. Same applies to Gorbachev's. He was optimistic and confident. She was high-strung and insecure. So was Raisa. He sailed through life while she worried, fretted, and feared the worst. He trusted those around him. She suspected people's motives and stood watchful guard against the slightest sign of disloyalty to her husband, as did Raisa. Many people found her trying, but Reagan, unfailingly upbeat, sunny-tempered, and distant, did not seem to notice how difficult she was. And this, again, applies to the Gorbachevs. Mrs. Gorbachev was in some ways the perfect Soviet first lady, the first Soviet first lady to fit the world standard. Smart, educated, sophisticated, fashionably dressed, beautiful. But the Russians generally didn't like that at all. Who elected her was the kind of things they would say about her. Okay, let me end with this kind of summary. Khrushchev was a flawed reformer. Gorbachev was, I think, a tragic hero. A hero because he tried to change his country and the world in the ways that I've tried to describe. And tragic because, in the end, he failed. The system collapsed on his watch. When he took the lid off the system, all kinds of quarrels and tensions arose, ethnic separatism on the part of non-Russian republics, and then eventually Ukraine and Russia itself, political polarization between hardcore communists and radical Democrats, economic chaos when the Communist Party was dismantled, which had previously kept the economy together. So what I'm saying is that if this is who they were and this is how they ended, personality helps to explain it. Both their efforts, you might argue, were doomed because it's very hard to change, to reform or to transform a political system, and especially in Gorbachev's case, to democratize a country that had never known democracy. And it's quite possible that Gorbachev's efforts were doomed, but I'm afraid his own characteristics help not only to explain why he made the attempt, but why in the end he failed. Let me just run through a few more pictures. That's Zdeněk Mináš, the Czech, with whom he was best friends in college. There's Mrs. Gorbachev as she looked in the polka dot dress when Gorbachev met her, students at Moscow University. Believe it or not, that's Gorbachev at Moscow University. I call this Gorbachev in his French actor phase. Now, this is a very interesting picture. Remember I talked about how Andropov took a liking to Gorbachev? Well, when Andropov came down to the Caucasus to vacation, Gorbachev was his host as party leader, and they would take hikes in the mountains and have campfires and cook shashlik. And in this picture, Gorbachev and his wife are sitting on a boulder, and Yuri Andropov is taking their picture. There, I didn't talk about him. This is Konstantin Chernenko, who was Andropov's successor. You remember Brezhnev died a year later. Andropov died a year later. Chernenko died. Chernenko was very sick, and when you see him sitting there, unable barely to move, it helps to understand why the leaders chose Gorbachev as the vigorous successor. Here are Reagan and Gorbachev at Geneva, synchronizing their watches. Here they are in a pool house by the lake. Here is Raisa looking adoringly at her husband. And here comes another part of Gorbachev's tragedy. Oops, sorry. I'll get to that in a minute. This is Yeltsin, who Gorbachev has humiliated, and now in 1991 is humiliating Gorbachev. And here is Raisa a year before she dies of leukemia in 1991. And here is Gorbachev weeping at her funeral. And after she died, a few months later, he was interviewed, and he said these words. He said, "I am guilty. I am the one who did her in." What he meant was that he had invited her to lead his life, for which, as I said a moment ago, she seemed perfectly suited as Soviet First Lady, but for which she was temperamentally unsuited. She was far more super sensitive than he. When he was criticized, she couldn't take it. When the August 1991 coup was carried out against him, it ultimately failed, but she had a minor stroke from which she never recovered. And then after he was ousted in 1996, when he insisted on running for Russian president against Yeltsin and the then communist leader, she insisted on going with him to 20 cities in several weeks. And on these occasions, when he was somewhere, some places welcomed, other cases people spit in his face or didn't let him into the hall. This must have been catastrophic for her. And in the end, in 1991, actually, he insisted on going to Australia, in part because the Australians had voted him the man of the century. And on the way back, it was a long, tiring trip. And not long after that, she was diagnosed with leukemia. Well, I don't want to end on such a note, so I'm going to go back to the picture of him at the beginning. There he is. And I'm going to end. And thank you for coming, and I will gladly undertake to answer any questions.